The Henderson residence sat on Oakmont Drive like a crown jewel, a four-bedroom colonial with manicured hedges, a three-car garage, and a pool that cost more than most people's houses. Margaret Henderson stood on her back patio with her third mimosa of the afternoon, surveying her domain with the satisfied expression of someone who had never been told no in her life. At 48, she had the kind of ageless beauty that required maintenance, the kind that showed at the country club and in the periodic text messages from her dermatologist. Her marriage to Richard had yielded two things: a substantial settlement after his indiscretion with his office assistant, and the time to pursue what she called property optimization, which meant complaining about everything. The neighborhood HOA meetings were her kingdom. She'd been president for 3 consecutive terms, and her reign was characterized by strict adherence to rules that she herself had written. No exterior paint colors outside the approved palette. No vehicles parked on the street overnight. No basketball hoops. No visible garbage cans. And absolutely, positively, no unauthorized use of community amenities. Her pool was not a community amenity. Her pool was hers. She'd installed it 5 years ago, spent $30,000 on the landscaping, another $5,000 on the water feature system. It was chlorinated to perfection, maintained by a professional service that came every Thursday. The thought of random neighborhood children splashing in her pristine water made her skin crawl, the sunscreen residue, the grass clippings, the chaos of it all. That was why, when she glanced up from her phone and saw a figure moving in the water at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, every muscle in her body tensed. She set down her drink. The figure was clearly a child, lanky, moving with the deliberate motions of someone who wasn't swimming for pleasure. Margaret squinted, her eyes narrowing behind her designer sunglasses. The kid was doing something to the pool, leaning over the edge. Scrubbing? No, the movement was wrong, too systematic. Margaret grabbed her phone from the patio table where it sat beside her half-read copy of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, a book she kept prominent for appearances, and zoomed in on the camera. The figure came into sharp focus, a boy, maybe 15 or 16, wearing work clothes. Dark shorts, a faded t-shirt, and Margaret's eyes widened. He had actual equipment: a pool brush, a skimmer net, a chemical testing kit. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered the phone. This was worse than a trespasser. This was an intruder with intent. She didn't know what his intent was, but she knew it wasn't good. Why else would a strange child be in her pool in the middle of a weekday, dressed like he was there to work? Was he stealing? Contaminating the water? The paranoia that had always lurked beneath her carefully constructed exterior bloomed into something darker and more urgent. Margaret didn't hesitate. She marched across the patio, her Bottega Veneta sandals clicking against the stone, and she grabbed the pool gate latch, locked as always, and shouted across the fence. "Excuse me, excuse-me." The boy didn't hear her. He was wearing headphones, moving along the side of the pool with a practiced efficiency that only made Margaret more suspicious. What kind of legitimate activity required headphones? She grabbed her phone again and dialed 911. The call connected after 2 rings. 911, what's your emergency? Margaret's voice came out sharp and breathless. There's a child in my fenced residential pool. He's clearly trespassing, and I don't know what he's doing here. I don't recognize him. He could be dangerous. The dispatcher's voice was calm but alert. Is he threatening you? He's in my pool. I don't know what he's capable of. I have a gated property, and someone has breached that gate and is. Ma'am, is anyone in immediate danger? Margaret looked at the boy, who was now using a chemical tester on the pool water, completely oblivious to her existence. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even visible to her anymore. She'd lost sight of him when she turned away. But the seed of fear had been planted, watered by years of neighborhood watch emails and local crime reports exaggerated in the retelling. I feel unsafe, she said. Please send someone immediately. We'll have an officer in your area within 10 minutes, ma'am. Can you stay on the line? Yes, I'll wait. Margaret stood at the fence, phone pressed to her ear, watching the boy through the slats of the gate. She tried to memorize his appearance: dark hair, olive skin, athletic build, probably Spanish or Italian. She hated that detail felt relevant, hated that it somehow made the scenario in her mind feel more dangerous, but she didn't examine that feeling too closely. She was doing the right thing. She was protecting her property. This was what responsible homeownership looked like. The boy finished testing the water and moved to the pool deck, where he began organizing bottles of chemicals in a neat line. pH increaser, chlorine stabilizer. His movements were professional, practiced, as if he'd done this exact job 100 times. Which meant Margaret realized with a fresh wave of anxiety that he might come back. She heard the sirens before the dispatcher did. The boy's head snapped up. Even from her position at the gate, Margaret could see the moment the headphones came off, the moment confusion crossed his face. He looked around as if trying to understand what had brought the sound of police cars to a quiet Tuesday in the suburbs. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of the Henderson house. Margaret hurried to the front door, gesturing frantically at the officers as they emerged. A man in his 50s, face weathered by years of suburban patrol work, and a younger woman with her hand resting casually on her belt. "He's in the back," Margaret said breathlessly. "The pool, he's in the pool area. I don't know how he got the gate open, but—" The officers exchanged a glance. The older one, his name tag read JMORALES, raised a hand gently. "Ma'am, we'll check it out. Can you show us the way?" She led them through the house, her heart pounding with a righteous sense of urgency. This was the right call. She had done the right thing. A stranger in her pool in the middle of the day when decent people were at work or managing their households with structure. It was suspicious. It was wrong. They stepped onto the patio and Officer Morales immediately saw the boy, who was now climbing out of the pool, his confusion evident even from a distance. "Stay right there," Morales called out not unkindly. The boy froze, half out of the water, dripping. Margaret could see the moment genuine fear overtook confusion on his young face. She felt a small twist of something, not quite satisfaction, not quite guilt, justified caution. "What's going on?" the boy called out, his voice adolescent and uncertain. "I was just—" "What's your name?" the female officer asked, moving closer. Marcus Chen. He looked at Margaret with an expression that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened?" Margaret's face flushed. She knew him. How did she know him? "You called the police on him," Marcus said, his voice rising with hurt and confusion. "I'm cleaning your pool. My mom is cleaning your house. She hired me to help with the pool maintenance. I've been doing this for 3 weeks now. Every Tuesday and Friday, I was just—" Understanding began to crystallize in the spaces between his words, but Margaret pushed against it. She didn't want to understand. Understanding was uncomfortable. Officer Morales was already taking out his radio, his expression shifting from alert to weary in the space of a heartbeat. The female officer was looking at Margaret now, and there was something in her gaze that felt like judgment. "Ma'am," Morales said to Margaret, not turning away from Marcus, "do you know this person?" Margaret's throat was suddenly very dry. "The cleaning service. Yes, the cleaning service, but I didn't know there would be someone in the pool. I didn't know." She had no idea, she realized. She had no idea. Her housekeeper, Lucia, came every week, came while Margaret was out at her personal training session or her lunch dates or her errands. She had never actually met most of the people who came with her, the landscapers, the pool people, the contractors. They were peripheral to her life, important only insofar as they maintained the appearance that her life required. "My mother is your housekeeper," Marcus said quietly, still dripping in his work clothes. He looked at the officers. "Should I get out of here?" "Not yet," the female officer said gently. "Can we get your contact information and your mother's? We need to confirm the arrangement." Marcus provided a cell phone number. While Morales made the call, the female officer looked at Margaret with something like pity. "You didn't know your housekeeper's son was working here?" she asked quietly. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. Lucia answered the phone on the second ring. Officer Morales identified himself and explained the situation. Margaret watched his face as he listened, watched it confirm everything that the female officer had already figured out, watched it become a kind of professional sadness, the look of someone who had seen this play out too many times in neighborhoods exactly like this one. "Ma'am," Morales said, pocketing his radio, "the cleaning service confirms that this is an authorized employee. He's been maintaining your pool for the past 3 weeks, and he was working with your permission, or rather with his employer's permission to be on your property. There's no crime here." The words hung in the air like smoke. "I didn't know," Margaret said weakly. "Right," the female officer said, not unkindly, just factually. "Well, I think we're done here. Have a good day." They left. Margaret stood on the patio, watching Marcus dry off with a towel he'd brought, watching him gather his equipment with the careful efficiency of someone who had been trained not to make waves. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just gathered everything and walked through the gate that he had somehow opened, with a key, Margaret realized now, not by breaching it, a key that must have been provided to him by Lucia. She had called 911 on a teenager doing his job. Margaret went back inside and poured another mimosa. Her hands shook as she did. She told herself it was a reasonable precaution. She told herself she'd done nothing wrong. She told herself that nobody needed to know about this, that it was just a small misunderstanding. But her phone buzzed with a text from her HOA vice president. "Is everything okay?" Heard sirens at her house. And Margaret realized that in a neighborhood like Oakmont Drive, where people watched each other with the diligence of hawks, there was no such thing as a small, private misunderstanding. Part 2, the story SBRADS. By 6 p.m., the incident had transformed. Margaret discovered this when she checked her Ring doorbell footage, something she did obsessively, multiple times per day, and saw several neighbors lingering on their driveways, pointing at her house. The narrative had already shifted. No longer was she a cautious homeowner protecting her property. Now she was the woman who called the cops on the housekeeper's kid. Her phone began to buzz with messages in the Oakmont Drive HOA group chat. DIANEROTHSCHILD, 6:14 p.m. Heard there was some excitement on our street earlier. Anyone know what happened? PATRICIAWILLIMS, 6:21 p.m. Police cars at Margaret's. At least 3. Must have been something serious. MARGRET, 6:22 p.m. Just a small misunderstanding. Everything's fine now. DIANEROTHSCHILD, 6:23 p.m. Misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding requires police, Margaret? Thomas Henderson, 6:28 p.m. I heard a teenager was arrested. Margaret's fingers moved quickly, her face burning. Nobody was arrested. It was just a precautionary check. A visitor to the property I wasn't immediately familiar with. PATRICIAWILLIMS, 6:35 p.m. This is exactly why we need better security protocols. I've been saying this at the meetings. DIANEROTHSCHILD, 6:37 p.m. I think we deserve to know what happened, Margaret. As HOA president, you should be transparent with us. The phrasing was calculated. By invoking her position, Diane was implying that Margaret had failed in some duty, that her role as president came with an obligation to explain herself. Margaret knew this move. She'd used it herself 100 times in board meetings and neighborhood disputes. She set the phone down without responding. But the damage was done, or rather it was only beginning. At 7 p.m., her landline rang. She almost never answered it. Most calls went to voicemail where they remained in perpetuity. But something made her pick up this time. "Margaret, hi, it's Lucia." Her housekeeper's voice was small, careful. Margaret's stomach dropped. "Lucia, I know what happened today. Marcus told me. You called police on him while he was working." The words were not accusatory, which somehow made them worse. They were just factual, delivered in the tone of someone who was used to accepting the worst interpretations of events. "Lucia, I didn't realize, I didn't know it was him. I didn't know about the arrangement. I didn't see him there and Margaret stopped, listened to herself, realized how it sounded. "Mrs. Henderson, I asked you 3 weeks ago if it was okay if Marcus helped with the pool. I asked you when you came home from your workout class. You said yes. You said, that's fine, Lucia, whatever you need to do to keep the house nice." Margaret's memory stuttered. Had that conversation happened? She tried to recall. Lucia coming into the kitchen with a bottle of cleaning spray. Lucia asking about something. Margaret, half listening, scanning her email on her phone. I don't recall that," Margaret said carefully. "But I appreciate you clarifying. I'm sorry for the confusion." "Marcus is 17, Lucia continued quietly. "He's a good kid, works 2 jobs to help me with rent. He's very careful and professional. He uses the pool service company's insurance. Everything was done properly. And now he's scared that he can't work anymore because you called the police on him." "I'm sure that won't be necessary. I can." "He told me not to come back," Lucia said. "He said he doesn't want to work for someone who thinks he's a criminal just because he's a Mexican kid in a suburban pool." "Lucia, I don't think." "You do, though. That's the thing. You do think that. If he was a white man in a suit, would you call the police? Would you even notice him? The question hung in the air. Margaret didn't answer because the answer was no. The answer was absolutely no, and they both knew it. I need to find another job, Lucia said. I can come back Friday to finish the cleaning, but I think after that I should look for a family that trusts me and trusts my family. I've been with you for 5 years, Mrs. Henderson. I've never stolen anything. I've never lost a key. I've never given you reason to be afraid of me or my son, and this is what I got. She hung up. Margaret sat in her pristine kitchen, staring at the blank phone. The house was suddenly very quiet. Everything in it gleamed, the stainless steel appliances, the marble countertops, the Italian tile. Everything was perfect and ordered and exactly as she had specified. And now it all felt like the interior of a beautiful tomb. At 8 p.m., her phone rang again. This time it was Richard, her ex-husband, calling from his new house with his new wife. "Why is your son texting me about you calling the cops on a kid?" he demanded without preamble. "My son, what does?" He saw the neighbor text, from Patricia or whatever. He's asking if his mother's a racist. So are you going to explain to me what the hell happened? Margaret's hands clenched. "It's not like that, I didn't realize." "You never realize anything, Margaret. That's been the problem since the day we met. You operate in this bubble where your property values and your social standing are the only things that matter and everyone else is just obstacles or entertainment. That's not fair. What's not fair is calling the cops on a child doing his job because he doesn't look like he belongs in your neighborhood." Richard's voice was cold in a way she'd never heard before. "What's not fair is that, and then acting like you're the victim when people are upset about it. Your son is embarrassed by you. He asked me not to tell you that, but he is." The line went dead. Margaret sat alone in her perfect kitchen and felt something crack inside her chest. But the night wasn't over. At 10 p.m., there was a gathering of sorts on Oakmont Drive. Not an official meeting, nothing with agendas or called quorum. Just neighbors on the sidewalk in front of her house, talking in low voices that carried clearly in the suburban night. Margaret watched them from her darkened bedroom window. Diane Rothschild was there, Patricia Williams, Tom Henderson, no relation to Richard, though often confused. Even the Patels from 3 doors down, who Margaret had spent considerable HOA meeting time targeting over their choice of a front door color. "It's a pattern," she heard Diane saying. "Remember when she tried to get the Koreatown family kicked out because their cousin visited too many times? She said it was a rooming house situation. And when she reported the landscaping truck for parking on the street," Patricia added. "The landscaper who takes care of 6 properties in the neighborhood, she said it was a safety hazard." Tom Henderson was shaking his head. "I'm not saying she did this because the kid was brown, but..." She didn't even try to talk to them first. She didn't knock on the door and ask questions. She just called the cops. "On a teenager," the Patel added. "In a neighborhood like this, you know how that plays out." Margaret closed the window. She didn't want to hear any more. But she could still hear them, the low murmur of agreement, of shared understanding, the narrative solidifying. The story everyone would tell about Margaret Henderson, the woman who called the cops on a housekeeper's kid. She grabbed her phone. Every group chat, every contact was suddenly alive with the story. It had taken on a life of its own. By tomorrow, she would be the racist who profiled a teenager. By next week, it would be one of those stories, one of those incidents that defined her neighborhood. At 11 p.m., Margaret did what she always did in moments of crisis. She called her therapist, who didn't answer because it was 11 at night and Margaret was not the only wealthy person in the city. Then she poured another drink. She told herself that this would blow over, that people would forget, that in a month there would be some new neighborhood drama to focus on, a violation of the landscaping guidelines, an unapproved paint color, some fresh violation of the sacred order of Oakmont Drive. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. Some stories once told change the shape of everything they touch. It started at 7 a.m. when the local news affiliate posted a story on their social media. Suburban police respond to reported break-in AT home, find authorized worker. There was a blurry image of her house, a vague description of a woman calling police on a teenager performing maintenance work. The comments section was already ablaze with people analyzing the scenario, inserting their own narratives. By 8 a.m., someone had identified her address and posted her name. By 9 a.m., someone had dug up her HOA position. By 10 a.m., the story had been reframed. Affluent neighborhood HOA president calls police on housekeeper's son. Community questions racial profiling. Margaret sat at her kitchen island with her laptop open, watching her reputation disintegrate in real time. Every refresh brought new comments, new shares, new people synthesizing her worst moment into proof of her worst self. Her phone rang continuously. Some calls were from people she actually cared about, or thought she did, checking in, ostensibly out of concern but really out of curiosity. Others were from people she barely knew, people who had her number for HOA purposes, who suddenly wanted to discuss community relations and cultural sensitivity. By noon, the HOA vice president, who Margaret had mentored, who Margaret had defended against criticism, sent her a formal email. Margaret, given the recent incident and its unfortunate media attention, the board has voted to call a special meeting to discuss HOA leadership. Please step down voluntarily from your position as president pending the outcome of this discussion. This is not a censure. We just want to give things time to settle before continuing with your presidency. Translation: Your reputation is radioactive and we need to protect ourselves. Margaret stared at that email for a long time. Then she called her lawyer. The lawyer, a man named David Chen, specializing in HOA disputes, listened to her explain the situation. His tone, when he finally spoke, was carefully neutral in a way that meant he'd already formed an opinion. The question you need to ask yourself, he said slowly, is what you want to accomplish here. Do you want to vindicate your actions? Do you want to make this go away? Or do you want to fight? I want it to go away, Margaret said immediately. It won't, David replied. It's already out there. The local news has picked it up. There's a small social media campaign. People are discussing your neighborhood as an example of racial bias. You're the face of that now, at least locally. So the question becomes, how do you manage the perception? By apologizing, Margaret asked quietly. There was a pause. Do you believe you did something wrong? I didn't realize the situation. I didn't know. Yes or no, Margaret? I called the police on a teenager who was doing his job. Why? Because I didn't know he was doing his job. But you could have known, you could have asked. You could have looked at your property records, your service agreements, called your cleaning service. You had options before calling the police on a minor. Margaret set down her phone, picked it back up. So I should apologize. If that's what you believe, yes. But I need you to understand what comes with that. An apology is an admission. It's an admission that you acted with insufficient information. It might satisfy some people, but it will also be used as evidence if there's any legal action. Legal action? What kind of legal action? I don't know if there will be any. But Marcus Chen's mother could theoretically file a complaint, claim harassment, emotional distress. It probably wouldn't go anywhere, but it would be public record. It would be another story in the narrative. Margaret felt the walls of her perfect life closing in. What do you recommend? I recommend you think very carefully about who you want to be in this situation. The aggressor who faced consequences, or someone who made a mistake and is trying to be better. But understand that there's no outcome where this doesn't hurt. You can only choose how much. After they hung up, Margaret sat for a long time. She thought about Lucia's voice on the phone. You do think that. If he was a white man in a suit, would you call the police? She thought about her son's embarrassment, her ex-husband's contempt, the neighbors on the sidewalk last night discussing her like she was a cautionary tale. She thought about Marcus Chen, 17 years old, working 2 jobs, now afraid to do one of them. At 1 p.m., Margaret picked up her phone and composed an email to the HOA board. She resigned, effective immediately. Then she called David back and told him to draw up an apology statement. She wanted it public. She wanted it on record. She wanted, though she didn't say this part, to undo what couldn't be undone. The statement went out at 3 p.m. I made a serious error in judgment. On Tuesday, I called police on Marcus Chen, who was performing authorized maintenance on my property through my cleaning service. I did so without verifying the situation, without attempting to understand the context, and I acted on assumptions that were wrong. To Marcus, to his mother Lucia, and to the community I have been privileged to serve, I sincerely apologize. I failed to live up to the values I've spoken about for years. I am removing myself from my position in the HOA and am committed to doing better. She hit send at 3:00 2 p.m. The responses came almost immediately. Some were supportive, this took courage. We accept your apology. Others were skeptical, too little too late. Others were just mean, glad you finally showed your true colors. But the story shifted again. Now Margaret Henderson wasn't a racist profiler, she was a cautionary tale about what racism looked like, even in unexpected places. She was a learning moment. She was a white woman finally admitting her prejudice. Which meant, in some strange alchemy of public opinion, that she had become useful again. At 4 p.m., she received a call from a local news station. Did she want to do an interview? To talk about the experience, about what she'd learned? Margaret almost said no. But then she thought about what that would communicate. More evasion, more silence, more evidence that she wasn't taking this seriously. Yes, she said, I'll do an interview. The interview was conducted by a woman named Shanice Torres, a journalist known for her empathetic but unflinching approach to social issues. They taped it in Margaret's living room, that perfect, sterile space she'd designed to impress people. Why do you think you called the police? Shanice asked, leaning forward with a recording device between them. Margaret had rehearsed answers to this question, but now, facing the actual woman, she couldn't deploy them. They felt false. She took a breath. Because he didn't look like he belonged, Margaret said quietly. Because there was a young man of color in my pool in the middle of the day in a wealthy neighborhood, and my first instinct was suspicion instead of inquiry. I didn't think about what that meant. I didn't examine where that reaction came from. I just acted on it. Do you think you're racist? I think I made a racist decision, Margaret said. I don't know if that makes me a racist person, but I know that I participated in a system that treats young men of color as suspicious by default, and I know that I could have chosen differently. What would that have looked like? It would have looked like walking to the gate and asking, "Can I help you?" It would have looked like calling my cleaning service before calling the police. It would have looked like assuming good faith instead of bad intent. The interview ran that evening at 5 p.m. By 6 p.m., it had been shared 2,000 times. By 7 p.m., news outlets across the country had picked it up. But Margaret noticed something. Nobody was asking Marcus Chen for an interview. Nobody was asking Lucia. The story had become about Margaret's growth, Margaret's awakening, Margaret's journey. Which meant, she realized with a new kind of shame, that even her apology was ultimately about her. Even her admission was a kind of performance. She called David back. I want to do something else, she said. Not for optics, not for the narrative, for actual restitution. What do you have in mind? I want to make sure Marcus Chen goes to college. I want to pay for his education. I want to set up something that covers his tuition, his housing, whatever he needs. There was a pause. That's very generous, Margaret, but you understand how it might look. Yes, she said. Like I'm trying to buy my way out of this, I know. But it doesn't change the fact that the kid needs help and I have resources. If my motives are suspicious, so be it. At least he benefits. I'll need to contact his mother, David said carefully. We can't just deposit money into his account. There are legal considerations. I don't care about the legal considerations. Just make it happen. That night, Margaret sat alone in her perfect house and waited for word from David. She thought about all the times she'd worried about her property value, her social standing, her image. She thought about how quickly it could all fall apart. She thought about how, in trying to protect what she had revealed what she'd always lacked. The internet, having built Margaret up as a reformed racist, was now equally invested in debunking her reformation. Within 48 hours of the interview, a blog post appeared analyzing her apology sentence by sentence, finding evidence of insincerity in every pause, every carefully chosen word. A Twitter thread accumulated 50,000 retweets dissecting the way she'd framed her actions as errors in judgment rather than racism. Screenshots of her old HOA minutes began circulating, highlighting decisions that took on new, sinister meanings through the lens of the recent incident. Margaret Henderson called for investigation of courageinaction family. The headline read, "What else has she done?" The investigation was surprisingly thorough. Someone had combed through the last 3 years of HOA records. They found a pattern: suspicious violations reported disproportionately against properties owned by people of color. Properties on the street that belonged to Indian families, Chinese families, Latino families. Violations that, when examined closely, were either trivial or not actually violations at all. Nobody could prove that Margaret had orchestrated all of this, but the appearance was there. The implication was clear. By the time David called her with news about Marcus Chen, the conversation felt almost obsolete. His mother agreed to meet, David said. She was initially suspicious, but I explained that this would be a no-strings-attached educational fund, established in trust, managed independently. Marcus can't access your money directly. It's completely separate from any ongoing relationship with you. That's good, Margaret said numbly. When? Friday afternoon, at my office. Marcus and Lucia will be there. You can offer the funds directly. Will she accept? I think so, David said. But Margaret, I need to be honest with you about what's happening outside of this. The media narrative is shifting. You're no longer being portrayed as someone who made a mistake and learned from it. You're being portrayed as someone who made a systematic pattern of racist decisions, who got caught, and who is now attempting to buy forgiveness. Is that not what I'm doing? It is, David said, but the difference is motive. You're doing it because you believe it's right, but that nuance doesn't survive social media. Margaret hung up the phone and opened Twitter. She read the threads about herself. She read the theories about her motives. She read the personal attacks, not all about what she'd done, but about her appearance, her wealth, her life choices. Some of it was deserved, some of it wasn't. Much of it she couldn't parse anymore because she was drowning in the volume of it. That night, her son called her for the first time since the incident. Hi, Mom, he said quietly. Margaret felt her throat close. Hi, honey, I read the interview, and I read what the internet is saying about you. I know it's not good. It's not about good or bad, her son said. He was 22, away at college, someone she'd raised to be thoughtful. I'm proud of you for apologizing, and I'm also realistic about the fact that people are going to use this for whatever they want to use it for. Some people will use it as a redemption arc. Some people will use it as evidence that you're irredeemably racist. Most people will just scroll past it. Does it make it better? Margaret asked. The apology, the fund for Marcus. It makes it better for Marcus, her son said. I don't know if it makes it better for you, and I don't know if it should. Maybe you're supposed to sit with how this feels for a while. After they hung up, Margaret realized she'd been expecting absolution from him. She'd been expecting him to say, "It's okay, Mom. You're a good person." She'd been hoping for that moral clarity that children sometimes provide to their parents, that sense that love could overcome judgment. But he was right. Maybe sitting with discomfort was the appropriate response. Friday came. Margaret drove to David's office in the downtown area, passing through neighborhoods she rarely visited, where the buildings were older and the streets felt more worn. She thought about Lucia making this drive daily, about Marcus working here, in a city that had judged him and found him suspicious. The office was small and professional. David was waiting for her, along with an empty conference room with a table, chairs, and nothing else to make anyone comfortable. They arrived at 2 p.m. exactly. Lucia looked smaller than Margaret remembered, though that might have been because Margaret had never actually looked at her before. She'd been part of the landscape, the woman who came on Thursdays and made the house clean. Now, looking at her directly, Margaret saw the tiredness, the carefulness, the way she held herself like someone used to being scrutinized. Marcus was taller than he'd seemed in the pool. 17, but with the bearing of someone who'd had to grow up faster than he should have. He wasn't looking at Margaret. He was looking at David, at his mother, at anything but Margaret. Thank you for meeting with me, Margaret said. Her voice sounded foreign, like someone else was speaking through her body. Lucia nodded, but said nothing. I wanted to speak to you in person, Margaret continued, because I wanted you to hear this from me directly. I was wrong. Everything about how I responded to the situation was wrong. I called the police on your son while he was legitimately working on my property. I did it based on assumptions and prejudices, and I know that no apology makes that right. Marcus finally looked at her. His expression was unreadable. I'm establishing an educational trust, Margaret continued. $25,000 to be used for Marcus's college education and related expenses. It's completely independent of any relationship with me or my family. It's managed by an independent trustee. The only condition is that it be used for education. She slid a folder across the table. David had prepared the paperwork meticulously. The numbers were legal and binding and irrevocable. Lucia opened the folder, scanned the documents. Margaret watched her eyes move across the numbers, watched her process them. "Why?" Lucia asked quietly. "Because it's right," Margaret said. "And because I have the resources to do it, and because I was wrong. Because I want Marcus to have options. Because I want him to know that one moment, one person's prejudice shouldn't determine his entire trajectory." "This is charity," Lucia said, not unkindly. "This is you trying to fix something you broke by giving money." "Yes," Margaret said, "it is. And I understand if you find that insufficient. I understand if you find that offensive. But it doesn't change the fact that Marcus deserves every opportunity, and I can help provide one of them." Marcus spoke for the first time. His voice was careful. "I don't want anything from her." The words landed hard. "I understand," Margaret said. "Do you?" Marcus looked at her directly now. "Because I don't think you do. I don't think you understand what it feels like to have a police car show up while you're working because someone called you in like you're a threat. I don't think you understand what my mom's been going through since this happened. I don't think you understand anything about our lives except that you've now decided you're the hero of your own story where you finally learned a valuable lesson." "You're right," Margaret said. "I don't understand. I can't understand. I can only know that I was wrong, and I can only try to be better." "That's not enough," Marcus said. "That's not enough for me to take your money and pretend this is fine." Lucia put her hand on his arm. "Meej." "No, Mom, I'm not taking it. I'm getting loans, I'm working, I'm doing it myself. I don't want anything from her." He stood up and left the room. Lucia watched him go. Then she looked at Margaret. Then she looked at the paperwork again. She picked it up carefully like it might bite her. "I'm going to talk to him," Lucia said. "He's angry. He has the right to be angry." "I know. But I will talk to him, because whether he's angry or not, this money will help us, and I won't let pride destroy my son's future out of spite." After they left, Margaret sat in the conference room for a long time. She had believed, foolishly, that the offer of money would create some kind of moment of understanding, that generosity would be recognized as such, that by offering restitution, she'd be offering absolution. But Marcus had rejected all of that, and somehow Margaret found herself respecting him more for it. That night, Lucia called her. "He wants to meet with you again," she said. "He wants to talk, but not through the lawyer, not officially, just talk." "When?" "Tomorrow. He's working at the landscaping company at 7 a.m. Are you willing to meet him there?" Margaret said yes, even though she had no idea what good could come from it. The landscaping company was in an industrial area that Margaret had never driven through. The kind of neighborhood where real work happened, where hands got dirty and bodies got tired. She felt oddly exposed in her BMW, oddly vulnerable in her designer clothes. Marcus was waiting for her at 6:55 a.m., standing beside a truck loaded with equipment, wearing work clothes and holding a coffee. He'd clearly been there for a while. He looked tired. "I didn't take your money," he said before Margaret could greet him. "I wanted you to know that. Your mother mentioned you were thinking about it." "I'm still thinking about it, but I wanted to talk to you first. I wanted to understand why you're doing this, and I wanted you to understand something about me." He gestured for her to sit on the tailgate of the truck. She did, awkwardly, her expensive jeans already dirty from the metal. "My mom came to this country when she was 23, Marcus said. Alone, no family, no English. She worked as a house cleaner and as a nanny, sometimes both at the same time. She sent money back to her parents for 5 years. She learned English from her employers and from the radio. She bought a house, nothing fancy but hers. And she raised me to believe that nobody is better than anybody else, even if they have more money or a fancier house." He took a sip of his coffee. "When you called the police on me, I was terrified. I was terrified that I'd lose my job, that it would affect my mom's job, that I'd have something on my record that would follow me. I was terrified because I knew how these things go. I'd seen it happen to other people. I'd heard the stories. And I was terrified that it would prove what some people believe, that people like me don't belong in neighborhoods like yours." Margaret wanted to say something, but Marcus raised his hand. "But then my mom sat me down and told me something. She said, 'Don't let one person's fear destroy your own sense of what you're worth.' She said that I'd worked hard, that I'd done nothing wrong, that I should be proud of what I was doing. She said that people like Mrs. Henderson, people who'd lived comfortable lives and never had to think about things like this, sometimes react badly to discomfort. And that didn't mean I should accept being treated like a criminal." "She sounds very wise," Margaret said quietly. She is, and she also taught me that sometimes people deserve a chance to be better. That sometimes a person can make a terrible choice and still be capable of change. She told me I should hear what you had to say before I made a final decision about the money. Marcus set down his coffee. So here's what I'm saying. I will accept your money for college, not because I forgive you, I don't. Not because I think this makes everything okay, it doesn't. But because my mom worked hard so I could have opportunities, and you're now offering me an opportunity. And I'm not going to cut off my nose to spite my face. I'm going to take what you're offering and I'm going to use it to make sure I never work for someone like you again. I deserve that, Margaret said. You do, Marcus agreed. And one more thing, I'm going to tell you what I wish more people like you understood. When you called the police on me, you didn't just threaten my future. You participated in something that's been happening to people like me for centuries. You looked at a young man and saw danger instead of a person. And whether you meant to or not, you communicated that I didn't belong. And that matters. That has consequences that go way beyond this incident. Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but she held them back. This wasn't the moment for her tears. You're going to go to college, Margaret said. You're going to be successful, and when you are, I hope you remember this moment. Not as a moment where you were wronged by a racist woman, but as a moment where you decided to take what was offered and make something better with it. And I hope that when you have power, when you have resources, you use them differently than I used mine. Marcus nodded. I will. They shook hands. It wasn't warm or comfortable, but it was real. After Margaret drove away, she realized she was crying. Not the neat, controlled tears she'd feared, but real tears, the kind that came from a deeper place than gratitude for forgiveness or relief for redemption. Because she'd been waiting for some kind of resolution, some moment where she could close the book on this chapter and move into the next one, improved and learned and better. But there was no such moment. There was only the ongoing work of being a better person, the repetitive, unheralded work of making different choices, of examining her own assumptions, of sitting with discomfort. The decision to move had come gradually, then all at once. She'd realized that the neighborhood had become a prison of its own making, a place where every neighbor watched her with a mixture of suspicion and judgment, where her past would always define her present. She'd listed the house on a Tuesday and sold it by the following weekend. Someone bought the privilege of that address, that pool, that perfectly manicured life. Hopefully, they would be more careful with it. She'd found a smaller house in a more diverse neighborhood. A place where she didn't know her neighbors immediately, where there was no HOA, where nobody knew her before this. She'd started volunteering with an organization that worked on community relations and racial justice. Not because it looked good, nobody was watching, nobody cared, but because it was the work that needed doing. Her son had come home for the summer, and they'd talked, really talked, for the first time in years. He'd asked her if she was doing this for him to make him proud. And she'd thought about it and said, "No, I'm doing it because it's right and because I should have been doing it all along." Lucia had sent her a photo. It was Marcus in his high school graduation gown holding his diploma. His mother was beside him, beaming. The note said, "Thank you for giving him this chance. Thank you for being brave enough to see what you'd done and do better." Margaret had printed out the photo and put it on her refrigerator, not as evidence of her redemption, but as a reminder of the work ahead. On a Tuesday in June, she drove to the landscaping company again. She brought coffee and donuts, a small gesture not meant to absolve anything but offered anyway. Marcus was there, loading equipment into the truck. He was working that morning, would be working most of that summer before college started. "I brought something," Margaret said, holding out the coffee. He took it. They stood in the early morning light. "I've been reading," Margaret said, "trying to understand the history I didn't learn in school, the ways that people like me participated in systems that harmed people like you. I'm not very far along, but I'm trying." "That's something," Marcus said. "I also wanted to tell you something," Margaret continued. "I was on the HOA board, and I made decisions that I now understand were discriminatory. I can't undo those decisions. But I'm working with a lawyer to see if I can document them, if I can create a record that might help people who were targeted. It won't reverse anything, but it might at least acknowledge that it happened." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. "That's the right thing to do." "It's overdue," Margaret said, "but I'm doing it." After Margaret left, Marcus sat in the truck, holding the coffee she'd brought. His coworker, a guy named Diego who'd been working there for 10 years, climbed in beside him. "That the lady?" Diego asked. Yeah. She trying to be friends now. Marcus laughed. No, she's trying to be better, that's different. Is it working? Marcus thought about it. I don't know yet. I think I'll know in 5 years, or 10 years, or when I have kids and I have to decide what kind of person I want to be to them. The truck pulled out onto the street, heading toward the first job of the day. Meanwhile, Margaret was driving home to her small house in her less expensive neighborhood. She was thinking about calling her lawyer, about the systems and patterns she needed to document. She was thinking about what it would take to be truly better, not just performatively better. It wasn't going to be a journey with an endpoint. That was the thing she'd finally learned. It was going to be an ongoing practice of paying attention, of questioning her assumptions, of doing the work even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching. She pulled into her driveway and noticed something she never had on Oakmont Drive, her neighbors sitting on their porch, waving at her as she got out of her car. She waved back. They didn't know her history. They didn't know about the pool or the phone call or any of it. To them, she was just the woman who'd moved in recently, who kept her lawn neat, who seemed quiet and kind. She could have used that. She could have let that become her new narrative, but she didn't. Instead, she thought about introducing herself properly, having conversations, understanding the community she'd moved into. Later that week, she would invite her neighbors over for dinner. She would make mistakes in the conversations, saying something thoughtless, revealing her ignorance. But she would listen when she was corrected. She would acknowledge her own discomfort. She would keep trying. Because the work of being better was never finished. It was never something you accomplished and then moved on from. It was something you did every single day, with every single choice, in every single interaction. It was a pool that had to be continuously maintained, not a destination you reached. Epilogue 1 year later. Marcus Chen's first semester of college was a success. He was studying engineering, working part-time to pay for incidentals that the trust didn't cover, maintaining the work ethic that had sustained him through high school. Margaret attended his first semester dinner, invited by Lucia, who had become something like a friend. Not the kind of friendship that erased history, but the kind that acknowledged it and moved forward anyway. Margaret brought champagne. Lucia brought food she'd made herself. Marcus brought himself, the full version of himself, not the carefully edited version he'd presented to Margaret at their first meeting. They talked about college. They talked about the landscaping company, where Marcus had trained several younger kids on how to do the work professionally. They talked about Margaret's work with the community relations nonprofit. None of it was complicated or simple. All of it was real. As Margaret was leaving, Marcus walked her to the door. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "I've been reading what you put out there, the documentation of the HOA patterns. It helped my mom's friend. She's challenging a violation that was never really a violation. The documentation gave her evidence, so what you're doing, it's actually helping." Margaret felt something in her chest shift. "That's good," she said. That's good to know." "But I also want to be clear," Marcus continued. "This doesn't make us friends. This doesn't undo what happened. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've been given, but gratitude isn't the same as forgiveness." "I know," Margaret said, "and I think that's the most honest thing you could say." After she left, driving through the neighborhood that had become hers, Margaret thought about what had changed. Not everything. She was still privileged, still wealthy, still living a relatively comfortable life. But something had shifted in the way she moved through the world. The ease she'd taken for granted was gone. In its place was a kind of careful attention, a willingness to be uncomfortable, a recognition that her comfort had often come at other people's expense. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The pool she'd been so proud of had been left behind when she sold the house. She'd never seen the new owners, didn't know if they took better care of it or worse. But sometimes, when she thought about it, she realized that wasn't the point anymore. The pool had been a symbol of everything she'd built her identity around: perfection, control, the appearance of a life well lived. And in one phone call, all of that had crumbled. In one choice, she'd revealed what was underneath all that perfection: fear, prejudice, a tendency to see threat instead of possibility. But in the work that came after, in the sitting with discomfort, in the slow and difficult process of becoming better, she'd found something more substantial. Not absolution. Absolution wasn't the work of justice. But perhaps something like the beginning of accountability. And with that beginning, a chance to actually do better every single day with every single choice. The pool, that beautiful, costly, perfect pool, had been the easy part. Cleaning it up afterward was proving to be the work of a lifetime.